Under the choking smoke of ruined factories, where the banks of the Volga groaned beneath the ceaseless pounding of artillery, history turned its pages with blood and ash. The battle for Stalingrad, fought between the late summer of 1942 and the frozen depths of February 1943, was no mere clash of armies. It was an apocalyptic struggle, a duel of nations, a crucible in which the fate of Hitler's empire and Stalin's motherland was decided. What began as the boldest thrust of Operation Barbarossa spiraled into the most devastating urban confrontation the world had ever seen. At the heart of this catastrophe lay Adolf Hitler's obsession. Stalingrad was not merely a city to him, it was a name. Bearing the name of his great adversary, Joseph Stalin, it became a symbol. To conquer it was to humiliate the Soviet Union. To hold it was to dominate the Volga River, that vital artery carrying oil, food, and weapons from the southern reaches of the Soviet Union into the heart of the Red Army. Thus, in the blistering heat of August 1942, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, began its relentless push toward the city. Stalingrad itself was no ordinary battleground. A sprawling industrial hub, it was home to the massive tractor factory, the Red October Steelworks, and the Barricade armaments plant. These were not only producing weapons, but, once under attack, became fortresses themselves, labyrinths of rubble, pipes, and furnaces where men killed one another at a distance of meters, sometimes with knives, shovels, or bare hands. A German soldier later recalled, "The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses." Stalingrad is no longer a town. Each house is a fortress, each cellar a death trap. We fight for a room, we fight for a corridor. By September, Paulus's army had encircled much of the city, pressing the Soviets against the Volga. Stalin had issued his infamous Order No. 22-7, not one step back. With blocking detachments stationed to shoot deserters, Soviet soldiers were hurled into battle with little more than rifles or sometimes nothing but grenades. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under the cover of night, ferried in small boats across a river alive with German shells. Many drowned before reaching the city, their corpses floating downstream in silence. Yet the Soviet 62nd Army, under the iron-willed General Vasily Chuikov, refused to yield. Case studies of certain landmarks within Stalingrad illustrate the hellish nature of the fight. Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment block, became a legend. Defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men, the building held out for 58 days despite repeated German assaults. The defenders fortified it with minefields, machine gun nests, and sniper positions, repelling waves of infantry and tanks. The Germans joked bitterly that it cost them more lives to take Pavlov's house than it would to conquer Paris. Meanwhile, the tractor factory became the site of some of the most savage clashes. Workers continued to assemble tanks inside the factory halls, even as German shells tore the roof apart. Newly built tanks were driven directly from the factory floor into battle, sometimes with factory workers still on board. These tanks fought not on distant front lines, but in the very streets where they had been forged hours earlier. By November 1942, Hitler's triumph seemed assured, yet the tide of war was about to turn. The Soviet High Command, under the meticulous planning of Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, prepared Operation Uranus, a colossal counteroffensive designed not to retake the city directly, but to encircle the encirclers. On 19 November, in blinding snowstorms, Soviet armies smashed into the flanks of the German Sixth Army. These flanks were manned not by battle-hardened Wehrmacht troops, but by poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions who were utterly overwhelmed. Within days, Paulus and his entire force were trapped in a tightening ring around Stalingrad. The encircled Germans numbered some 250,000 men. Hitler forbade any retreat. Instead, he ordered them to hold out, promising that the Luftwaffe could supply them by air. But the reality was far grimmer. The Sixth Army required 800 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe could deliver barely 100 on good days, often much less. Hunger, frostbite, and disease became deadlier than the Soviets themselves. Soldiers resorted to slaughtering their horses for food, then dogs, then even boiling leather belts and shoes into broth. Eyewitness accounts describe men collapsing in the snow with blackened feet, their bodies left frozen in grotesque postures until spring thaw revealed them to scavengers. The German attempt to rescue the encircled army, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, failed. The Soviets held firm, tightening their grip. By January 1943, Paulus's army was reduced to a skeletal remnant. Ammunition was gone, food nearly non-existent. Yet Hitler still demanded they fight to the last man. In a cruel twist, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal on 30 January, the highest rank in the German army, pointedly noting that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to take his own life rather than fall into Soviet hands, but he did not. On February 2, 1943, surrounded, starving, and broken, he surrendered. The numbers tell the enormity of the disaster. Of the 250,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, only about 90,000 were taken prisoner. Of these, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany, most perishing in Soviet captivity. The battle cost the Germans nearly 800,000 casualties, including their allies, while the Soviets lost over 1 million soldiers and civilians. The city itself was reduced to rubble, with estimates suggesting that over 80% of its buildings were destroyed. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the material one. For Hitler, Stalingrad was the shattering of the myth of German invincibility. For Stalin, it was the turning point, proof that the Red Army could not only resist but destroy the Wehrmacht. For the world, Stalingrad became a synonym for endurance, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of total war. When historians today walk through the modern city of Volgograd, they tread upon the bones of the fallen. Beneath apartment blocks and parks lie unmarked graves of thousands. The colossal statue, "The Motherland Calls," standing on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands dozens of times, remains one of the most haunting memorials to the battle. It is not merely a statue, it is a scream carved into stone, echoing the fury and agony of that winter. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a last stand for Nazi Germany's eastern ambitions, a point from which the war could never be reversed. It was a clash that shattered an army, broke an empire's illusions, and declared to the world that the tide of the Second World War had turned.